In the summer of 1867, deep in the rolling farmlands outside Sedalia, Missouri, a story began that would haunt American medical archives for generations. A story so disturbing that the Missouri Historical Society sealed the official records for over a century. That story was about a boy named Timothy Caldwell, 8 years old, blonde hair, pale skin, eyes the color of winter, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The war had ended barely 2 years earlier. The land still carried its scars: empty homes, burned fields, men who returned with missing limbs, and children who never learned to laugh again. Among those struggling families was Thomas Caldwell, a man hardened by the Civil War and the cruel silence that followed. He had lost his brother James at Wilson's Creek and his sister-in-law to consumption soon after. When he received a letter telling him that another brother, William Caldwell, had died in the hell of Andersonville Prison, Thomas took on the last living piece of his family, William's son, Timothy. The boy arrived one April morning in 1866, carried in the back of a cart, wrapped in a gray blanket that seemed far too heavy for his small frame. He said nothing at first, just stared at the house, at the trees, at the empty fields. When Thomas's wife, Sarah, leaned down and smiled, Timothy tilted his head slightly, as if studying her, not greeting her. "He's quiet," Sarah whispered later that night. "Too quiet," Thomas replied. "But after what he's seen, maybe that's a blessing." At first, Timothy seemed like any other orphan, obedient, polite, hard-working. He rose before dawn, fed the hens, carried water, and never complained. He spoke softly and always said, "Yes, ma'am," or "Yes, sir." Neighbors would often comment on what a well-mannered child he was. But some noticed things. Mrs. Wilkes, who lived down the road, claimed that Timothy never blinked during conversation. Another man swore he saw the boy standing in the cornfield at midnight, watching the scarecrows sway in the wind. And when animals began dying, first chickens, then a cow, Thomas blamed wolves. But there were no bite marks, only strange, perfect, circular bruises on the necks of the dead livestock. It was around this time that Dr. Samuel Harding entered the story. A former field surgeon turned small-town physician, Harding had seen the worst humanity could do: men screaming with limbs blown off, fever epidemics sweeping through camps. He was not a man easily disturbed. In June of 1866, Harding first met Timothy when Thomas brought him into town. The boy had cut his hand on a sickle, and Thomas wanted it stitched. Harding recalled later in his journals, "The wound was shallow. What drew my attention was not the injury, but the boy himself. His gaze was analytical. When I reached for his hand, he did not flinch. He watched my every motion, not with fear, but with a kind of detached curiosity, as though he were observing me for a study, rather than being treated as a patient." Dr. Harding would later fill 3 leather-bound journals about Timothy Caldwell, journals that no modern scientist has been able to fully explain. Over the months that followed, the Caldwell farm began to fall under what locals called the hush. Animals refused to enter certain barns. Neighbors who visited said they felt the temperature drop near the house, even in midsummer. And once, Sarah awoke in the middle of the night to find Timothy standing beside her bed, holding one of her sewing needles. He said he'd been counting her breaths. "I wasn't scared," Sarah would tell Dr. Harding later. "Not at first. He looked so innocent. But there was something wrong about the way he smiled." By autumn, 3 people were dead. A farmhand named Jacob Lee broke his neck after falling from the hayloft, though witnesses said they'd seen him arguing with Timothy earlier that day. A local boy drowned in the creek behind the Caldwell farm, his body discovered with both eyes open and a strange expression of peace. And a traveling preacher who had scolded Timothy during Sunday service was found lifeless in his wagon, hands clenched tight around his own throat. There was no evidence, no signs of struggle, only coincidence, and a child whose pale blue eyes seemed to follow every tragedy. Dr. Harding began visiting the farm regularly after that. Officially, he claimed he was concerned about Sarah's nervous exhaustion. In truth, he was studying Timothy. He noted how the boy's pupils never dilated properly, even in darkness, how he could sit for hours without moving, his breathing shallow but steady, and, most disturbingly, how the boy would sometimes repeat entire conversations word for word, including voices and tones, days after hearing them once. Harding wrote, "His mimicry is perfect, but lacks empathy. It is as though he understands sound but not meaning, a reflection of humanity without the soul behind it." In November of 1866, an incident occurred that forced Harding to involve the local sheriff. Sarah Caldwell was found unconscious in the kitchen, her hands covered in blood, her own or someone else's, she couldn't say. Timothy stood beside her, calm as ever. When asked what had happened, he simply replied, "She tried to stop the noise. I helped her sleep." No charges were filed. Sarah recovered, though she refused to stay alone with Timothy again. She later confided to Harding that the boy had been conducting experiments in the barn. Small animals, she said, frogs, birds, sometimes rabbits. Harding inspected the barn and found crude drawings scratched into the floor, circles, lines, something resembling the human nervous system. He took sketches and returned home shaken. "This is not the mind of a child," he wrote. "This is the mind of an observer, detached, purposeful, lacking the moral restraint that defines the human conscience." As the winter of 1866 approached, the town began whispering the word curse. Parents forbade their children from playing near the Caldwell property. Merchants refused to sell to Thomas on credit. The pastor urged the family to pray, though even he avoided their doorstep. Thomas, proud and stubborn, refused to abandon his land. He told Harding he didn't believe in curses, only weakness. But by December, the nights were never silent. Sarah would hear scratching beneath the floorboards. Doors opened on their own. And Timothy began keeping a journal of his own. When Harding discovered it weeks later, the entries chilled him to the core. The handwriting was small, neat, and disturbingly precise for an 8-year-old. The first page read, "They don't see what I see. The patterns, the colors under the skin. I can hear them when they sleep. The rhythm slows when they dream. I think I can make it stop." By the start of 1867, Dr. Harding knew something terrible was coming. The deaths, the whispers, the strange behavior, all pointed to a single, unexplainable truth. This child was not merely disturbed, he was inhumanly aware. In February, Harding requested permission to take Timothy to St. Louis for psychological evaluation. But Thomas refused. He didn't trust doctors, especially ones who spoke of demons and disorders in the same breath. 3 days later, the Caldwell's last horse was found dead in the field, its skull fractured from the inside, as though something had burst outward. Sarah packed her belongings and begged Thomas to leave. He said they couldn't, that people would think they'd gone mad. That night, Harding's final entry for the month was short. "Something is wrong with the boy's reflection. I observed him through the mirror of my carriage for several seconds. It did not move." The final weeks of winter were the last time anyone saw Timothy as a child. In March, during a particularly harsh snowstorm, Harding received an urgent message. Thomas Caldwell was missing. When Harding arrived at the farm, he found the fields covered in untouched snow. Only one set of footprints led from the house to the old limestone cave near the riverbank, a place the locals avoided. Inside, Harding found what would later be described in his journals as a workshop of unspeakable intent. Animal bones, glass jars, hand-drawn anatomical sketches, and, in the center, a wooden table covered in thin copper wire and crude instruments, far too complex for a boy of 8 to construct. Timothy stood beside the table, perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back. When Harding asked where his uncle was, the boy smiled faintly. "He's resting," Timothy said. "He said he finally understands what I am." Harding's candlelight flickered across the cave walls, illuminating symbols burned into the stone, not occult, not religious, but mathematical. Precise. He would later write that it reminded him of nerve pathways mapped across a body. Only these mapped something else entirely. Harding brought the boy back to town that night. He told Sheriff Crawford everything, or at least everything that could be believed. A search party found what was left of Thomas Caldwell 2 days later, buried shallowly behind the barn. The coroner noted no sign of struggle and no clear cause of death. The body was drained completely of blood. Timothy was placed under medical observation in Harding's care, and for 6 months the doctors studied him in secrecy, filling the pages of his journals with drawings, charts, and questions that would haunt scientific minds for decades. But the story of Timothy Caldwell was far from over. The true horror, the events that would make him one of the darkest enigmas of the 19th century, were still to come. In the months that followed, the boy's abilities would evolve. Experiments would be found that defied known biology. And 3 more people would die within the walls of Dr. Harding's own home. This was not possession. It was not madness. It was something worse, something science still cannot explain. Narrator, low, calm tone. Following the death of Thomas Caldwell, Dr. Samuel Harding took guardianship of Timothy Caldwell under the guise of medical supervision. But what began as an act of compassion soon became a descent into obsession, a study that would consume Harding's mind, his reputation, and perhaps his sanity. The doctor had convinced Sheriff Crawford and the Sedalia magistrate that the boy was merely unstable from trauma. The sheriff didn't argue. No one wanted to see the boy in jail. So Harding took Timothy into his home, promising to observe and rehabilitate him. For the next 6 months, he would document events that even he could not explain, events that challenged the limits of 19th century science and the limits of human nature itself. The Journal of Dr. Harding, Entry 1, April 1867. It has been 3 weeks since the boy came to stay in my home. His behavior is impeccable, polite, articulate, unnervingly calm. Yet I feel a growing sense of dread in his presence. It is not what he says, but what he does not say that chills me. There is intelligence behind those eyes, something ancient, deliberate. I sometimes wonder whether I am studying him, or he is studying me. Dr. Harding lived alone since his wife's death. His home on the edge of town doubled as his clinic, an old Victorian with creaking floors and walls lined with books on anatomy and psychology. He converted one of the spare rooms into a study for Timothy. The boy spent hours sitting quietly, drawing, writing, or staring out the window. At first, the doctor believed this to be the silence of trauma, until he noticed something unusual. Every morning, the boy's drawings were different from the day before. Not improved, evolved. One week, he drew flowers. The next, those flowers were dissected, each petal labeled with strange symbols. Then came sketches of the human form, nerves, muscles, organs, illustrated with precision no 8-year-old could possibly achieve. Harding began to suspect the boy possessed not only remarkable intelligence, but knowledge no child of his era should have access to. By May, Timothy's nightly behavior grew stranger. He never seemed to sleep. Harding often found him awake in the early hours, sitting upright in bed, his eyes fixed on the dark ceiling. When asked why he didn't rest, the boy answered plainly, "I'm listening to the quiet, Doctor. It changes every night." Harding noted this, unsure what it meant. But soon he began to hear it too, the faint hum that filled the house at night, a vibration that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The local carpenter inspected the foundation, found nothing, no loose boards, no drafts, just silence, and that low hum, that never left. By early summer, Harding made a decision that would haunt him forever. He decided to treat Timothy not as a patient, but as a subject. He began a series of controlled observations: sleep deprivation, temperature exposure, sensory isolation. The results defied explanation. Timothy's heart rate never changed, even when frightened. His pupils did not dilate under bright light. His body temperature remained constant regardless of weather. But most disturbing of all, his blood. During a routine test, Harding drew a small sample and noticed that it did not clot as normal human blood should. It shimmered faintly under lamplight like mercury. He wrote in his journal, "There is an element present I cannot identify. The substance resists coagulation, but under magnification reveals crystalline structures that seem to shift, as if alive." Harding sent a sealed vial to the Missouri Medical College in St. Louis. The vial never arrived. The courier vanished on the road between Sedalia and Jefferson City. Neither he nor the sample was ever found. Now by June, Harding's housekeeper, Mrs. Lillian Pierce, begged the doctor to release the boy. She complained that objects moved when he was near, that she could feel cold fingers brush her neck when she passed his door. When she confronted Timothy one morning, he only said, "You shouldn't be afraid of the things that watch. They're not watching you." That night, Mrs. Pierce packed her things and fled town. Harding found her later trembling in a church pew, unable to speak coherently. The priest told him she claimed to have seen 2 Timothys standing at the top of the stairs, one smiling, one expressionless. Harding's obsession deepened. He believed Timothy's condition might represent a new stage of human evolution, or something beyond humanity altogether. In his desperation, he began cross-referencing his notes with ancient texts, writings on mesmerism, phrenology, even fragments of Mesopotamian myth that spoke of beings born with perfect reason, but no soul. One night, Harding caught Timothy in the attic. The boy had drawn symbols in chalk across the wooden floor, perfect circles intersected by geometric lines. At the center lay a bird, perfectly still, eyes open but alive. Timothy looked up and said calmly, "I stopped its heart, Doctor. But I didn't kill it. You can start it again if you listen right." Harding watched in horror as the bird suddenly twitched and gasped back to life. From that moment forward, Dr. Harding's journals shifted tone, from scientific detachment to fearful fascination. He wrote, "This is not hypnosis, not suggestion. The boy possesses knowledge of physiological control that exceeds any medical understanding. His experiments suggest intent, not accident. If I could decipher his method, perhaps the boundary between life and death itself could be altered. But every discovery came with a cost. Each week, something else in the house changed. Clocks stopped ticking. Mirrors fogged from within. The garden wilted despite the rain. And one evening, the doctor's dog was found dead. Eyes open, tongue black, heart intact, but hollow. In July, 2 men from St. Louis arrived, representatives from the Missouri Medical Board. They'd heard rumors about Harding's unorthodox child experiments. Harding tried to send them away, but Timothy greeted them politely. He offered tea. By morning, both men were dead in their rented carriage outside the inn, their faces pale, expressions serene. The coroner's report listed natural causes, but Harding's notes say otherwise. Both men exhibited identical cranial lesions, small, circular, precise, like the puncture marks found in Thomas Caldwell's skull. I found traces of that same crystalline residue beneath their fingernails. He burned their clothes, their letters, and buried their watches in his garden. From then on, he no longer left the house at night. By late August, Harding began to fear the boy. He had once been fascinated. Now he was terrified. Timothy's demeanor never changed, but there was something new in his eyes, amusement. During one dinner, Harding asked him directly, "Timothy, do you understand what death means?" The boy set down his spoon, looked at the doctor, and said softly, "It's not the end, doctor. It's the pause between questions." Then he smiled, and the glass in Harding's hand cracked without being touched. That night, Harding dreamt of the cave near the Caldwell farm, the one where he'd found the bones and diagrams. But this time, in the dream, the cave was filled with light. And standing in the center was not a boy, but a grown man with Timothy's face. When Harding awoke, his hands were bleeding. The shapes of the cave symbols were carved into his palms. On the night of September 3, 1867, a violent storm swept through Sedalia County. Lightning struck trees, barns caught fire, and the river flooded its banks. Harding locked every door and shuttered the windows. Timothy stood by the window, watching the storm. He whispered, almost to himself, "It's time to finish the experiment." Harding demanded to know what he meant, but the boy didn't answer. He simply walked upstairs, calm and silent. Moments later, the hum began again, louder than ever before. The doctor followed, calling his name. He opened the attic door and froze. The chalk symbols had returned, glowing faintly in the lightning flashes. In the center, Timothy stood barefoot, eyes closed, hands raised. Harding described what he saw next in his final journal entry for the night. The air vibrated. My instruments cracked. The boy's voice changed, deeper, resonant, echoing from within my own skull. He spoke words I did not know, yet somehow understood. I felt my pulse slow, then stop. For a moment, I was dead. When Harding woke, the storm had passed. Timothy was gone. Only the faint outline of those symbols remained, burned into the attic floor. The town searched for weeks. Sheriff Crawford organized patrols, scoured the woods and the caves, but Timothy Caldwell was never seen again. All that remained were Dr. Harding's journals, and the evidence of a phenomenon that defied every law of nature. But this was not the end. Because a month later, strange letters began arriving at the Missouri Historical Society, written in Dr. Harding's handwriting, dated 10 years in the future. Each letter described medical theories that would not be published until decades later. The handwriting was confirmed as authentic. The signature, identical. But Harding himself would be found dead in 1891. His heart stopped mid-beat, body unaged since 1867. So what happened to Timothy Caldwell? Was he a child of nature, or something born beyond it? A new form of human intelligence, or a vessel for something older than science itself? No one knows. But researchers who examined Harding's journals decades later noted something disturbing. Between the lines of his writing, faintly pressed into the paper, as if written in invisible ink, were the words, "It's not over." By winter of 1868, the mansion of Dr. Jonathan Harding had fallen into silence. No letters, no reports, no trace of Timothy Caldwell. The last communication received from Harding was a single telegram sent to the Royal Institute of Medical Studies. One sentence only: "The boy is not what we believed." After that, nothing. Weeks later, when authorities finally arrived at the estate, they found every door locked from the inside, windows blackened, furniture overturned, and beneath the laboratory floor, a trail of dried blood leading into the stone cellar. Dr. Harding's journals were found scattered, some half-burnt in the furnace. From what survived, investigators pieced together his final weeks with the boy. They read like the unraveling of a man who had stared too long into something ancient, something that mimicked humanity, but wasn't bound by it. Good. Harding's Journal, December 4th, 1868. Timothy does not age. His wounds close before my eyes. His blood, black as tar, rejects every known reagent. He sleeps with eyes open, murmuring words that precede language itself. The house groans when he dreams. Thunder rumbles outside. Narrator Harding's colleagues assumed delirium from exhaustion, but the handwriting changed, steadier at first, then jagged, frantic. Aaron Harding's Journal, December 10th, 1868. He stood by my bed again, spoke my name in a voice not his own, said he was almost finished borrowing the skin. The experiments were never meant for this. Ow, the skin. That word appeared 6 times in the final entries, and then abruptly one final page, half burnt, the ink smeared by blood. Harding's Journal, December 12th, 1868. I see it now. He is not a boy. The real Timothy died in the carriage crash. What we pulled from the river was a shell. It needed a body. It needed mine. The final lines were written in 2 different handwritings, Harding's and another, smaller, neater script. The words repeated in perfect symmetry, as if written by a mirror. Dr. Harding is asleep now. He understands. Pause. Low, distorted voice murmurs indistinctly. When police opened the laboratory, they found 2 tables, one with the remains of Harding, the other empty. Chains broken. Candle wax melted into the outline of a small hand. No sign of Timothy Caldwell. But on the wall, scratched deep into the plaster, investigators found a single sentence: "He walks where the light ends." The Caldwell family name disappeared from records soon after. The estate was abandoned, sealed, and eventually demolished in 1891. But locals say, on cold nights near the river, you can still hear the sound of a boy's voice, repeating words that no one has ever translated. And sometimes, when the moon hits the water just right, a reflection appears that doesn't belong to anyone standing there. Timothy Caldwell. The boy science couldn't explain, because he was never meant to be explained.